Welcome. This is the third part of Module 2's video in the web mapping course. In the second module, we learned how to make a map service. And now what we want to do is look at how we configure this service so that there's a bunch of parameters that we can control, change, make it look exactly like we want it to look. And we need to see how some of those parameters work. So before we use basically all the defaults, we're going to see how we can make some changes and make your map even more functional. So this is back to the same menu that we looked at before to do our publishing, the service editor. And we had basically worked with analyze, preview, and publish. We put some stuff in the general area here, but we really did not worry about any of the parameters that are shown down on the left-hand side here. So what we want to do is look at some of what we can control and how we can make some changes. And we're not going to really go into every possible change, because there are literally hundreds of different ways things can be configured, but we're going to look at some of the more common ones. So if you notice, we're on the Parameters tab. And when we look at the Parameters tab, we get this area called Anti-Elasting. And we have none enforced. And what anti-elasting is, it cuts down that sharp edge between items. So it makes things a little bit more general blending. So instead of having a really sharp edge, they appear a lot more smooth. And by appearing a lot more smooth, they're more appealing to the eye. Notice when you use anti-elasting, this will change the speed of the processing. So if you don't use it, you're going to find the process runs quicker. But you get choices here. You got to pull down here for anti-elasting, and then for text anti-elasting, you have another pull down here, and you can make changes there. So this is some of the things that you can change in the parameters. The capabilities is an important consideration. We have a whole large group of different types of maps that we can make. The first one is always checked, and that's the default, and that is the typical map service, which we made a few moments ago. In the previous video, we showed you how to do that. So you got all these other types of services. KML is checked right now, and that deals with a Google map, how we want to use that potentially. Another one that we will utilize will be the feature access service. But you can only use the feature access service when you are using a relational database. That's the only time that'll work. When you select any of these, additional items come down the left-hand side. And so we want to explore a little bit about these additional items down the left-hand side. So the first one, the default one that always happens, the one that we created earlier, the mapping service, shows us where the rest and the SOAP are, the full URLs. And remember, we use this test 111 here. So, those are what we used, and this is the server we used, which is a production server that we have. And we can choose 3 different modes here. Data allows us to access the attributes. Map allows us the map to be drawn in other applications such as Silverlight, which we'll talk about later, and Flex. And then query, as its name indicates, gives us the ability to query information about the map. And generally I check all 3 of these. The more you check, again, changes the speed of operation potentially for you, but I find it's critically important to have all 3 of these checked. Now we went down here to the feature access. Feature access, we've not made a feature access yet, but we will be making one and showing you how to connect to a relational database. Notice it looks fairly similar to what we just looked at. It now says feature service, where the slide before these said map services. But now we can do things like create, delete, queries there, that query was there before, and we can do update. Sorry, I forgot to turn off one of my sound features. So these are things that you can only do when you have editing rights. And so with a feature class, you will have editing rights. But again, remember, you don't give everybody in the world access to the editing rights. So just because some people have access to the feature class, when you change things on the feature class, it will change it in the mapping service. So when you build a general map for people to look at that are non-editors, they're going to look at the mapping service and not look at the feature service. There's also this KML, and what KML is a Google format, and notice, is it compatible with Google Earth, Google Maps, Google Mobile? There's some other parameters here which we're not going to worry about right now, just using the default. And then we have some choices here such as separate image, single image, and vectors. Typically I leave KML on, but to be very honest, I have rarely used KML in any of my mapping. It's normally using feature access and mapping services, so really should turn this off because it does take processing time, so it does slow down the process. But if you do plan on using any of your data with a Google map of some type, then it's important that KML is turned on in your server. Okay, you can see pooling here is now selected, so we drop down from capabilities to pooling. Pooling involves how many instances of the service is running, so how many different data streams are coming out of my service at one time. The more data streams that we have coming out, the slower the service is going to run. And you can see that the default usually is 1 and 2 here. 1 is the minimum number, 2 is being the maximum number. But if you know there's going to be a lot of people hitting your map, you might want to increase the number here. And then you also have some things about timeout. So if somebody leaves the map open, how long is it till it times out? And there's the ability to change those also. Processes. How often will your map recycle automatically? Now you can manually recycle when you want to. What time do you want this recycling to occur? Usually you need to look at what time zone you're working in. So I work in the Eastern time zone, so I got to be aware that if I recycle at midnight my time, that's only 9 p.m. Pacific time, which may mean some of my colleagues are using that service at that time. So I got to be very careful when I do this recycling. But it should be done when there's very little traffic on your machine. Caching is an extremely important part. This is a vector cache situation because we know the lines on our maps are actually vectors when we're in ArcMap. They're basically vectors that we're working with, but we have to cache this so that it draws quickly. So a cache basically goes in and draws something, and sometimes the first time you use an area for a while, it will have to recache, and it's a little bit slower to use. Then sometimes when you've used an area a lot, it'll draw very quickly. Now, the scale range here really tells us what's going on here. So we've got a minimum scale on which things can be viewed at, and we've got a maximum scale which they can be viewed at. Notice we're at a scale range of 3 as our minimum, which they tell us is basically a continental view. And we're at a 17, which is basically a city block as our maximum. The more scale ranges that I use, the more memory it's going to take up. So if we're looking at something only at the city level, we might start our scale range somewhere maybe in here, maybe down around 13, 14, 15, and ended up at the city block level. Or if we're looking at something that's much more worldwide, we may be down in this area and not be up here in the high detailed area. So you've got to be aware of what you're doing so you don't overcast, but you make sure you have enough information there that can be used in things. The item description area is your metadata. And it's important to put metadata in here. We got some errors when we try to publish our map. that we didn't have a summary, we didn't have tags here. We can choose tags that we've used before. A description is good. Credits, you should always give credit where credit's due. And also what type of copyright might be on it and who can use your information. Can anybody attach to your server and use your information? It's restricted just to your application. So you really do need to be aware of some of this. And you really should put metadata in anything that you create. And then sharing is the last one. Sharing has to do with connecting to ArcGIS Online. I've already signed into ArcGIS Online, and I'm still getting an ArcMap. I've not gone to the server interface yet. Still in ArcMap, so I've already signed on. So you're seeing my content here. So we've got things like, who's this shared with? My content only, my group, or is it shared with everybody in the world because it's public? If I'm making a map service, it's probably going to be shared with everybody. When I'm making a feature class service, it may only be shared with myself or maybe a couple other people. And also we can do groups. So these are some of the groups that we have. This is a class group and the National Geotech Center group here and some other groups that I'm a member of. So who do we share with is critical, again, to make sure that it's widely accessible if it needs to be widely accessible on ArcGIS Online, but also from the standpoint that it's controlled and not just made available to everybody, completely open source. Once these parameters have all been set up, you can then republish your map or publish a new name for your map, and these parameters will take place and be used from then on. It's always good to go in and control in the server manager some of the items about the program, making sure that it serves the purpose. For example, if you're going to use your map with some open source software, you might need to have a different parameter chosen than just map services because your open source might not be able to read the Esri format of map services where it could read one of the more universal services. So it is important to make sure you configure things properly. I want to spend a few moments to show you what a typical enterprise type system might look at. This is my firewall. This is my protection area. Anything that's on the outside of my firewall, the bottom as this image, is things that's accessible to anybody. Things that's behind my firewall are the things up on the top. So my storage array is behind my firewall. My relational database server is behind my firewall. Those are not public-facing items. I can access them if I'm inside my firewall. I can use a VPN client to access them when I'm outside my firewall. But these are areas that we don't want the general population to access. The designer might be somebody like yourself that's designing maps. We have an ArcGIS server here, so the designer can send information over to the ArcGIS server, and then the server can serve it out to a user or can serve it out to ArcGIS Online. Now, depending on the user, it depends on what level of service this might be. So if this is a person who has editing rights, it might be a feature class service. Let's say it is a feature class service. So I change something on my computer screen here on my feature class service. It transports itself back to the Arc server. The Arc server says, I know where the data is. It's back here in this relational database, and goes back to this relational database to be updated. If I'm only a user, then all I can see is what's coming down this pipeline in one direction. I can't send anything back up the pipeline. The only thing I can do is things like turn on and off services and things like that. So it's important to build an enterprise system. Part of it needs to be behind a firewall, be very protected. Your SQL server should always be very protected. It should always be behind a firewall and not in public space. This is your web services, and your web services can be fed directly to ArcGIS Online and our mapping applications, which we'll talk about later on in this module. And it can also be sent to just general users directly from the Arc server or using an intermediate ArcGIS Online. So these are some of the data pathways that you might be dealing with.